Hello class, today we are looking at emotivism with Charles Stevenson from a textbook written by Bansidhar Deep, who is from India. So this paper is written by Bansidhar Deep about Charles Stevenson and specifically Charles Stevenson's emotivism. And so Bansidhar Deep is from India, and he is teaching out of the People's University of India, the People's University of Indira Gandhi, IGNOU, and this is the way in which we are starting to look at how it is that we understand emotivism. And so when we're looking at emotivism by way of Charles Stevenson, we want to see emotivism, and even when we were looking at the is-ought problem with David Hume, we want to see these positions as meta-ethical. And so just to remember, meta-ethics is a way in which Stevenson's position is similar to Hume's strategy, whereby we must identify that the source of morality is emotionally based and non-cognitively based, i.e., we are not urged to believe a moral position as right or wrong, rather that morality has its basis in an emotional attitude in terms of approval or disapproval that is strong enough to motivate others. So what you're wanting to look at here is that Charles Stevenson's position is really more of a refinement of the way in which we were understanding David Hume's position, okay? And so clearly with this reading, we'll be examining emotivism as meta-ethical, and this is mainly developed by the American philosopher. In other words, emotivism is mainly developed by the American philosopher Charles Stevenson, who was born in 1908 and dies in 1978. And he studied under G.E. Moore and also Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he is influenced by the way in which we understand the post-war period, and likewise logical positivism. In other words, he was influenced by logical positivism, and logical positivism is a 20th century Austrian school of philosophy. So a proponent of logical positivism considers the way in which the only meaningful problems are solved by logical analysis. And so you want to see that he was inspired by the logical positivists, but he departs from central tenets of the logical positivists, okay? So the logical positivists felt that the only statements that are valuable are statements that are empirically and logically verifiable, okay? And so here we have a central question as to the full extent and disconnect between scientific facts and our views on emotion and morality / ethics, okay? So, in other words, the logical positivists felt that the only way in which we're understanding statements are the way in which we understand things empirically and the way in which we're thinking of these elements as logically verifiable. Okay, so the disconnect is between scientific facts and our views on morality. And so here we need to have a somewhat of a foregoing in terms of what is meant by non-cognitive. So that which is non-cognitive is a way in which we are not basing or reducing our empirical and or our factual knowledge on reason alone. And the background and relevance of feelings should be thought of in Stevenson's case as non-cognitive. Okay? So these non-cognitive attributes or feelings play a significant part in our moral outlook. Okay? And so we do have the developer of logical positivism, A.J. Ayer. A.J. Ayer is a famous logical positivist. He was born in 1910 and passes away in 1989. And he had strong claims in terms of, quote, moral judgments are not verifiable, i.e., they are not neither analytic statements nor statements of fact. They are instead merely affective and emotional expressions of one's approval or disapproval of some action by a person, unquote. Okay, so one thing to get a hold of there too is that the logical positivists were thinking in terms of philosophy by way of how it is that we use language. Okay, so these points on statements have to do with this idea that the way in which we're understanding things in general for morality should not be based on analytic statements nor statements of fact. Okay? And so this is an issue whereby Charles Stevenson wants to develop his position on emotivism. So this is, these points of A.J. Ayer's are from his book, Logical Truth and Logic from 1936. And so yet we need to recognize a couple of points. Although Stevenson is using A.J. Ayer's thesis as a starting point, we need to be super careful to see a few critical differences, of which we'll indicate in a few minutes. And so also notice too that a lot of what we're engaged with here is also tied to language, as I pointed out, and how language gets used. In other words, speech, sentences, statements, words, and understand that in the context of morality and emotivism, the way in which we are understanding morality is also a way in which we're understanding our use of language. So obviously, emotivism is a meta-ethical viewpoint that refers to moral judgments, sentiments, words, and speech acts. So in other words, we're looking at the structure of how it is that we're basing morality. We're not looking at how it is that we're indicating what's right or wrong and offering a normative theory of that position or those justifications. So that's how it's meta-ethical. And so, in other words, we have the question, are our judgments or our moral judgments and moral sentences, moral words, and moral speech acts factual or not, question mark. And these are the types of questions that Stevenson leads us to in order to base the way in which we understand morality in emotion. Okay? So one primary judgment is that of concern for Stevenson is that our definition of the word good is something we need to take into consideration. In other words, if we're going to consider a basis for morality, we need to at least look at how it is that we're understanding what we think of as good, okay? And so if we're to define a theory, the term good needs to be front and center of that theory, okay? So we need to see the definition of the good as unambiguous. We also need to see that this definition may involve several defined meanings, and also the meanings must contribute to our understanding of the term good. And although that point sounds relatively obscure, what we want to think about is that if he's thinking on this meta-ethical level, Stevenson is thinking on this meta-ethical level of how it is to base morality in terms of emotion as an emotivist stance, He's suggesting that not only do we have to consider emotion, but we also need to consider a basis of how it is that we're understanding goodness in general. Okay, so that's his point there. That in other words, and it's also a good point to think of in terms of ethics in general, that in other words, when we're thinking of ethics in general, we're always positing that it must be a way in which we're understanding goodness as well. Okay, and that's really the point he's making there. And so Stevenson also puts aside the notion of interest, that is to suggest that the good must not be limited to what is desired or what is approved by way of other people, i.e. the good cannot, for the emotivist, just be a matter of approval. Rather, it must be emotively approved of. So it can't just be based on approval alone. That approval needs to be backed up by emotion. Okay? So it's really kind of a slight splitting of hairs where he's saying, in a way, he's suggesting that when we are emotional, we could see that others can approve of those emotions, but the way in which we're understanding morality cannot be just on that approval. We need to see that that approval has the grounding of emotion. So very similar to how it is that we're thinking of David Hume in terms of this grounding, this meta-ethical grounding. And so add to these three criterias of Stevenson's theory of the good as far as a definition for emotivism. In other words, one, we must allow for a disagreement as to whether something is good. In other words, it can't be confused with just mere interest theories. Number two, goodness must be acted upon for its own sake. That is to say, I might not desire to do good. That is to say, I might not desire to do good for its own sake. And three, goodness must not be verifiable by way of a scientific method or scientifically understood alone, or as a psychological or empirical testing of what's good or not good. Okay? In other words, we cannot see emotivism as grounded in a scientific way, as we are tempted to do oftentimes. And that point is what we were looking at with David Hume in terms of the is-ought problem. So, quote, what is goodness cannot be reduced to a set of scientifically knowable and testable facts about things, okay, unquote. In other words, ethical judgments are not statements of fact for Stevenson. So again, this is why we need to understand David Hume to see the difference between scientific and cognitive, our scientific and cognitive understanding that shouldn't be mistaken for our emotivist feelings for a grounding of morality. So with regard to emotivism, Mr. Deep writes, quote, the key criterion according to the emotivists is that the attitude expressed by a person in terms of moral judgments is not cognitive, but that it has a motivational element. So when we're thinking of something that is cognitive, usually that's a way in which we are understanding things as reasonable, okay? In other words, if I'm having a cognitive understanding, I'm having a reasonable understanding. And in this sense, Mr. Deep is pointing out that Stevenson is showing us that we shouldn't confuse what is cognitive to be a way in which we're understanding emotivism. But we can see that the way in which we are getting others to identify with and feel what we're feeling in terms of morality, that it has an motivational element. That is emotional as well. And so moral judgments are expressions of emotions that are approved or disapproved, yet they are not just mere facts that are cognitively understood just as facts alone. And so here's where we need to be extremely careful not to confuse Stevenson's emotivism for moral subjectivism. So this is the point as well that we wanted to do with David Hume, is to not confuse what he's pointing out as a type of relativism, okay? Or better said, we shouldn't confuse Stevenson for an ethical relativist, which is an ethical position whereby a subjectivist believes that all morality is subjective and that there's no ethical objectivity. That is not what Stevenson is pointing out. Likewise, that is not what David Hume was pointing out. In other words, for a relativist, we make a claim that morality is subjective, and a relativist denies moral objectivity. The emotivist is not only expressing an emotion, but insisting that emotion is a way in which we motivate others to see our and feel our ethical positions. Okay? So with ethical relativism, and for the ethical relativist, we make a claim as to an ethical assertion and subjectivity, right, that is right, whether it is a fact or not. But that is not to be confused with what Stevenson is pointing out. So yet with Stevenson's emotivism, emotivism is not a moral judgment as a fact. It is an ethical, is not a moral judgment or an ethical assertion. Rather, it is an expression of an emotion, okay? I.e., this is not a factual assertion of an emotion. So really, so much of the emphasis on emotivism stems from an anti-positivist, non-cognitivist position, contrary to the position whereby we want to look at moral judgments as scientific facts. Okay? So for an emotivist, there's always the possibility of resolving ethical judgments in terms of bringing about agreement of one's beliefs, as well as an attitude. Yet, this must not be mistaken for statements of facts in a scientific sense. Okay? So, as we mentioned earlier, we need to be sure to distinguish Stevenson's position from Ayer's, okay, from A.J. Ayer's logical positivist position, whereby with Ayer, if moral judgments are not logical truths or statements of facts, then ethical concepts are, for Ayer, pseudo-concepts, or just plain nonsense, i.e., they don't have cognitive significance. And also for Ayer, moral judgments are emotional. Yet what's to be distinguished here between Ayer and Stevenson is that this is in this claim of quote-unquote nonsense. That is to indicate that the emotional value of a moral judgment is not simply meaningless as Ayer has it. Rather, for Stevenson, the value is given value due to the way in which the very notion we seek to have others share in our emotion is important. So such an action or a position or activity is something by the way in which we motivate others to take on our moral stances. Okay? And so here the distinction is between a descriptive, scientific, factual accounting versus an emotive or value-based way in which we are understanding things. And so that also is a way in which we are identifying the is-ought problem for David Hume. Okay? So for the cognitivist, he or she identifies moral judgments with beliefs. To believe something is good, I must see this not as a fact to be concluded or believed, whereby I need to back up. So for the cognitivist, he or she identifies moral judgments with beliefs. To believe something is good, I must see this as a fact to be concluded or believed. Okay? Whereby for the emotivist, he or she sees a moral judgment as the basis of a feeling or an attitude and not as a mere fact. So now returning to the way Stevenson is examining the all-important question of understanding our use between good, between the term good, that shifts a moral judgment as not based solely on mere approval, which also differentiates Stevens' position from Ayer's. Rather, approval or disapproval is also based on goodness, is what we need to see there too, because just approval itself reduces moral and ethical judgments to moral relativism. In other words, I'm not just approving of something, I'm seeing that that approval needs to have the basis of emotion, okay? Again, that we're in the context of, given that we're in the context of language use, we must see that there's a difference between our confusions with facts and values, or facts and morality, where moral judgments are non-cognitive, and they're non-cognitive ways in which we use language, and facts are the way in which we are reliant on fact-driven cognitive use of language. And so we don't believe moral judgments as we do facts alone, and we feel value and moral judgments, okay? So that's the thing, is that we're not necessarily understanding morality, we're feeling morality. So the question for the emotivist, as Mr. Deep points out, is how is it that we have the power of influencing people with our ethical statements, our ethical sentences, as emotivists? For Stevenson, this power is derived by our dynamic use of words to create moods, to bring about actions and attitudes. And so here we have another distinction Stevenson makes between the use and meaning, between use and meaning. That is to suggest meaning should not change and fluctuate with various usages. That is to indicate that the dynamic case of language usage is that we are emotionally identifying what is good as having a pleasing quality that is attributable to value. Yet, the sense of goodness is not just about approval alone. It's also about the feeling of goodness that is attributable and likewise valuable enough in terms of approval. It's enough to share our feeling about a particular action to gain that approval in terms of our moral statements and judgments. So really, with Stevenson, we need to see that disagreements over moral judgments are not to be confused with disagreements of belief. Moral judgments, rather, should be seen as disagreements in attitude. In other words, these are disagreements of interest. To have the same interests is not the same as suggesting that one necessarily believes in a moral judgment. It's really an aim to get others to share one's interests. Yet we need to establish that the good is not just based on favorable interests that are based on facts. The interests I have in terms of the good is not factually given, rather it is emotionally constituted, as we were looking at with David Hume. And it is non-cognitively valuable. And so for Stevenson, we cannot define good in terms of interest alone or in terms of strict cognitive belief. So the interests of the good must be based on emotional value of the good in order for us to bring about our moral viewpoints and our moral feelings for things in order to motivate others to share with those feelings and our morality. So thank you, and we'll talk more about this in class, and